when I think about the idea of could consciousness have purposefully evolved in plants, I see less utility for plants because they live on such a long time scale, and the things that threaten them, at least usually, they don't react to them quickly enough in the moment. There are some plants that do, though, so maybe they would be a different case.
Do you think plants that are more responsive might be more conscious?
You are tuning in to The Multiversity, a podcast for higher dimensional education.
Join us as we explore philosophy, science, history, and the great unknown.
Okay, so the field of plant consciousness exploded into public attention in the 1970s when the work of Cleve Backster was popularized by the book and film The Secret Life of Plants. Baxter was a lie detector expert who hooked up a lie detector to his plants and found that they seemed to respond to strange things. Now, plants have electrical signaling that takes place in their leaves. This is uncontroversial. This has been known since the 19th century. They think that the diurnal response of plants, where they open and close on day and night, is due to ions moving between their cells. That is electrical activity. But the thing that Baxter found that was so surprising was that the plant's electrical activity seemed to be in response to the emotions of animals in the area around them. So when Baxter thought about hurting the plant seemed to have a strong electrical response. One experiment, he killed shrimp in the room next to the plants, and they seemed to have a strong response to that too. So Baxter presented his experiments to the world, and a lot of people concluded from this that plants have empathy and emotion and subjectivity. This was a big thing in the 1970s. But in the decades since, many scientists have tried to replicate Baxter's experiments, and none have been able to. So it's considered discredited scientifically, but it still floats around in the popular consciousness. What do we make of this, guys?
So, looking into some of Baxter's experiments, they're interesting. I don't think that they really prove what he claims to have proven. It's suspicious that he hasn't repeated his experiments after other people attempted to repeat them and weren't able to replicate them. It's suspicious to me that he didn't kind of insist on replicating them in a proper way if he truly believed that they were replicable. But some of the results certainly are interesting. I initially misunderstood the brine shrimp experiment when I looked into it. It's kind of complicated to weed out the whole experimental design, but basically it seems like, well, not it seems like, he hooked up the leaves to the lie detector. He went into another room and set up brine shrimp on like a random timer so that they would drop into boiling water at different times to see if the plant reacted like telepathically to the death of the shrimp. And he did that by randomizing the times that the shrimp was going to drop and then recording whether the plant had a spike in electric activity during the same 25-second chunk of time that the shrimp actually dropped. And in 11 out of 13 times that shrimp dropped and fell to their death, there was a reaction. And then there were some 60 control blocks of time where he didn't drop anything. And in only 8 out of those 60 times, there was a reaction. But there was also a lot of noise in this experiment. So, like, a lot of noise.
And it's worth noting too that he threw away a lot of his results due to them not showing the kind of patterns that he thought were the kinds of patterns that they should show. So he basically looked at his data and identified some patterns as having too much noise or as not being valid and threw them away. Mm-hmm. So that's also very suspicious to me. Mm-hmm. Because not saying that he did this, but you can make data look like whatever you want to make it look like if you're throwing away some of it.
That's true. That is true. Though I think even with the amount of data that he threw away, it still would have been statistically significant if it was included.
That's not clear though. Because like statistical significance doesn't mean that just that there was a little bit more reaction in the shrimp condition than in the non-shrimp condition. Statistical significance means that there has to be a less than 5% chance that the result would happen by pure random chance alone.
Yeah, I know. We'd have to run the analysis, and I don't remember exactly how many pieces of data he threw out, but I feel like it was less than 10 pieces of data, and I'm just kind of ballparking.
I think I'm not sure if he was throwing away pieces of data or whole lines of results. Like I think it sounded to me like he was throwing away whole lines of polygraph results. So I'm not sure what those, I'm not sure exactly how much data he threw away. I think we'd have to go into more detail.
Yeah, that's an important.
Yeah, it says he threw away entire charts. 2 charts were disqualified for mechanical failure. 3 charts disqualified for displaying gross overactivity. And 3 charts were disqualified for not displaying typical fluidity. So it's like the entire run of those experiments were discarded.
Oh wow!
So
not just blocks. How many charts were there total?
Out of 20 charts, in the end, 13 were left. So that's just under 2/3. So he threw away just over 1/3 of his data.
Okay, yeah, I rescind my claim then. That could make a whopping difference.
Do you have thoughts, Kurt? I know you followed up a bit on some of the attempts to replication in Russia and stuff like that.
yeah, so people in that, what was the article, the Chemetz article that was very critical of him? They talked about the replications. And
the Cornell replication is the main one.
The Cornell, okay,
Yeah,
sure. So one important thing to note is that in Baxter's original paper, this published in a parapsychology journal, he mentions, as a means of attempting to avoid possible complications from living organisms other than those included within the experiment design, all experiment sessions were scheduled at a time which favored keeping such potential interference at a minimum. So he's clearly saying here that you have to account for people or other living things interacting with the plants, because he thinks that that's going to be a factor in whether they're going to react to other stimuli. And so in the criticism, they mentioned how Baxter responded to their failed replications and said that, well, this isn't valid because you did things like wash the plant half an hour before you did the experiment, so that's going to interfere with its energy or its psychoenergy or whatever whatever is the proposed mechanism here. So it does make sense. If you're trying to do an experiment with psychoenergy, then you have to control for psychoenergetic factors. And if you don't control for those factors, then it's not going to be a reliable replication. So while I'm pretty critical of, I guess I'm critical of Baxter's paper now, having reviewed it with the evidence, the data that he threw out, but I'm also critical of some of the replications.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. If he did say you have to control for psychoenergy and he said it before the replications occurred?
Well, this is what he said in the original published paper. And so it's clear he's not just stipulating exactly what to control for, which is I guess you have to be clearer about that. But he is saying you have to control for those things. And it makes sense you'd have to control for those things.
Yeah,
Right.
the whole premise of the study is that plants react to psychoenergy.
Yeah, and I guess this claim, it's not clear though that he didn't make it clear beforehand though that psychoenergy is sticky and that if you're touching the plant beforehand, then it ruins the results. So I'm still like a little bit fishy about that, because it seems like if that was such an important factor, like because the thing about replications is you can't come out, if he didn't say it beforehand and then he came out after and he was like, actually this thing, you didn't do this thing that you have to do, and the failed replication is invalid. Like that's a post hoc explanation. You can always come up with something that was wrong after the fact. But if beforehand It's not clear to me that beforehand he was saying you have to control for psychoenergy, and psychoenergy is sticky, so you can't be touching the plant before the experiment. There's this period where you can't touch the plant. And I'm a little bit suspicious because it seems to me that if that was such an important factor in determining the successful outcome of the experiment, he should have stipulated it beforehand. It's not clear to me that he did.
Right. But this is the weird thing about it. Like, if you discover a new type of energy, how are you going to know beforehand how it's going to behave? So I understand why these post hoc hypotheses, post hoc explanations have to be, excluded in the scientific process. But if you're exploring something and you don't know what's going to affect something, it would make sense that you say after you receive more evidence, you say, well, hang on, I have to adjust and rethink about what's going on here.
It's just not clear to me that he found anything at all. Like the experimental design was so flawed, and also he was using a lie detector, which is a very gross electrical measuring device. Like an EEG can zero in on much more subtle electrical energy, and they've never been able to find anything. And that also, it makes me suspicious. It makes me seem like he was just picking up on, like we don't even know, he might have just been picking up on noise. Lie detectors have a lot of noise. So it's not, he might not even have been picking up on the actual electrical signal of the plant itself.
Maybe. It's really hard to say.
Basically, it just seems like this experiment doesn't give us enough to conclude anything at all. Maybe it could prompt further research.
Yeah, so I think scientists in the West tried to replicate these experiments. They didn't have a lot of luck, and then the experiments in the Soviet Union by Pushkin and in Dubrov and some other scientists there, they had some success, but it wasn't really with the exact model that Baxter had laid out. It was a separate model. So what they found was, using the methodology proposed by Baxter, the results were very inconsistent. Even though it seemed like sometimes they were getting somewhere, it didn't really reproduce very well. So what they did is they devised another methodology where you have, say, a plant in the middle of the room. Near the plant, you have a subject, and then you have a hypnotist. The hypnotist hypnotizes the subject and gets them to experience certain emotions, or say, put yourself in the mind of the plant. Like you're no longer Tatiana, you are this plant that's seated on the table in front of you. And then they would imagine certain scenarios. Say somebody comes up to you in a park and he looks like a very mean man and is about to stomp on you, or a toddler looks at you and finds you very pretty or something like that. And having the polygraph or the galvanic skin response detector connected to the plant, they found that they did have a response. Now, this is a bit tricky because I can't actually, or it's difficult for me to find the scientific papers. The version of this book, this is Parapsychology and Contemporary Science by Dubrov and Pushkin. So they did more than, according to these documents, they did more than 300 of this class of experiments and found very positive results.
Yeah, I mean, that's intriguing basis for further research, and it could be interesting to go into the Russian and read the actual study. But the fact that they did 300 experiments is like itself like, okay, like they did the initial experiment, it didn't work. So what they did like 300 other experiment, like when you do a whole bunch of experiments on something, it's easy to cherry pick the ones that get the result you want and be like, look at this amazing thing we found. When you use hypnosis, it works. When they identify with the plant, it works. But we don't know what else they did. They could have done another 100 experiments where they're like, do this, do that, try this, try that, try this, and those got no results, because the fact is that if you perform an experiment enough times, eventually something's going to happen. Eventually you're going to get the result you want just by pure probability alone, right?
Yeah.
Like if I flip 10 coins 100 times, there's going to be some instances where all 10 coins are heads. Probably.
Yes.
Maybe not for sure with 10 coins, but you know, with 10 coins, actually that probably wouldn't happen. If I did it like with 4 coins, but anyway. But you see my point, though? The fact that they did so many experiments kind of demonstrates that, like,
Yes.
it makes me suspicious.
Well, no. Well, that's really funny because if it was a small sample space, you would say that's suspicious. And now
It's not the sample space, though. It's the number of experiments is different from the sample space. The sample space is the number of subjects. The number of subjects, you want more subjects generally. Higher N is good. But the number of experiments is a different metric. If you do a lot of experiments...
That's fine. My point is, if it were only one experiment, like, say, Baxter, we would be suspicious. But now you're saying there's 300 experiments, and that also makes you suspicious. It seems like you're almost just looking for an opportunity.
No, I think you're making generalizations, Kurt, to discredit me. But actually, what I'm saying is completely valid. The difference between different scientists replicating one experiment with trying to get at whether this phenomenon exists, there's a difference between that and a difference between a different group of scientists trying replication, having the replication failed, and then trying 300 variations on the experiment. And I don't know what they did. I'd have to read the actual study. I don't know what they did.
Yes.
And people also sometimes conceal things from studies. There's a difference between a group of scientists trying an experiment 300 times in slightly different configurations and then cherry picking the ones where they got with the result they wanted. Like, that's the thing. If you do an experiment enough times, eventually it will show the result you're looking for. But you don't, if you're doing it, if you're throwing, who knows what they did, what did they do with the other 298 experiments? Like, did they just throw away the ones where they didn't get the result they're looking for? We don't know what the methodology was. Like that's why with statistics, you have to be very specific and precise. You can't generalize and say a lot, a little, a lot is good, a little is bad. Like, you have to be very precise and look at what actually is being measured and what actually is happening, because statistics are so tricky. And it's so tricky to have something that sounds good, like they did 300 experiments, and have that actually be a vessel through which confounds can flow.
Okay. But I think that the counterpoint is that, okay, so say they try 10 different things and maybe one of them is successful, and then they take that and they say, okay, so using the hypnotist is successful, and then they go on and attempt to replicate that themselves a lot of times, which is exactly what you do.
That's completely valid. That's completely valid. Like, if you try like 300 variations of the experiment and like 2 of them work, that's fishing. Right. That's a valid thing to do. It's fishing. You're fishing for something that might work, but that doesn't actually prove that thing works. That the thing, you do a follow-up at that point with only the hypnotism experiment, and you do the hypnotism experiment alone a few times. You report every time you did it, and if it works like every time, or like a statistically significant number of times, then you say, we've given some validity to this hypothesis.
Yes, that's right, and I think they according to these documents, they attempted that hypnotist model many times. So, and one thing I had to question when I read this, because it's the English version, at least, it's just intended for the general public. So I was like, is this guy, like, who is Pushkin anyway? Is he even a scientist? Is he just a fiction writer? Well, I had to look up who it was, and that's the thing. So I had to try to find some information, and he was actually, Pushkin studied and did research at the same university as one of my old English students, and I asked him for some help, and he helped me find some documentation showing about Pushkin's history. Pushkin wasn't a parapsychologist. He was just a psychologist in general, aside from these experiments. He was a labor psychologist and did some other work. So it seems that Pushkin isn't just some guy off the street. He is a scientist. He's a psychologist. So at least in my mind, that's said to me. Even though I can't read the papers, at least there's some reputation behind it.
Well, that would be interesting to get those papers translated into English.
Yes.
Yeah, it'd be intriguing to read those original studies. Okay, so as of yet, I'm not convinced that there's any valid weight of evidence supporting the idea that plants respond emotionally to things. Yeah. That these electrical signals in any way correspond to emotional stimuli in the world. But I mean, I'd be open to the possibility if more compelling evidence emerged. And I think that's where I'm at the end of this discussion.
That's where I'm at too.
Yeah. I guess I'm less certain that I was. I kind of came into this with a bit of bias thing because I just want I want something fantastic like this to be true. But I have to be skeptical, especially of Baxter's experiments. So who knows?
I appreciate your intellectual honesty around that, Kurt. So whatever else we may think of it, Baxter's work shows that sometimes radical new ideas do not make it into established science. However, some do. Like the idea of plant communication. So back in this same time period, the 60s and 70s, plant communication was considered to be an equally ridiculous, radical, fringe idea. The idea that plants communicate with each other. Now it's mainstream science. Scientists now know that, like trees, for example, communicate a ton of things through their roots. They exchange nutrients, they share information, and they help each other survive from predators. So they not only share messages, they share molecules, or the messages are in the molecules. So that's something really interesting. And we also know, we've known this for a long time, but the more and more evidence is showing that plants collect, we also know that plants collect a ton of information from their environment. That humidity, light, sound, chemical conditions, gravitational conditions, and much more to help them survive, decide where to allocate molecules and in which directions and to what degree they should grow. Some people would call this plant senses, plants having senses, while others would say that only animals can have senses. So this isn't even the limits of it. We're more and more finding out that plants are actually very dynamic beings and are skilled problem solvers. Like Katie, do you want to give another example?
Sure. So there was a really interesting story that happened in the late 80s, early 90s in South Africa. It had to do with this animal called the kudu, which is basically like a smaller antelope. And kudus were ranched there in this area. And there was a suspicious issue of a bunch of kudus falling dead, like healthy seeming kudus in their fenced off ranches dropping dead after there had been a drought where most plant life had died. However, there was enough food for them from one source that had managed to survive the weather conditions of that year, which was the acacia tree. So the kudus had been eating the acacia tree. And basically when it was investigated what was going on, what was the cause of death of these kudus, it was found that they had abnormal levels of tannins in their stomach. Tannins are like the substance in wine that can sometimes make you a bit nauseous. It's basically a poison that some plants produce to ward off insects. And what they found was that the acacia trees, when they were put under stress, when they were being overeaten, reacted by producing extreme amounts of tannins to the level that it was able to actually kill off their predators. And another thing that was interesting is that acacia trees, even outside the fenced-in area that weren't being eaten but were just nearby, potentially connected by roots, potentially connected by the air. They didn't dig into how the communication was happening. But nearby acacia trees who weren't being overeaten also started overproducing these tannins. So it provided evidence, one, that the trees were reacting in a very real defensive way, and also that they were communicating this information to each other somehow.
Yeah, it's super interesting. It's worth noting that like all these examples we've brought up so far are uncontroversial. It's established science that these things happen and have happened. If you get into stuff that's a little bit more radical, but still within the scientific norms of scientific acceptability, Monica Gagliano recently conducted experiments where she took potted plants and dropped them from a short distance for a small impact. And at first, when she started doing it, the plants would like shut, like they would show like a panic reaction. But after she did it a few times and the plants were okay, the plants eventually habituated to it and they stopped reacting to the impact. And she calls it
like
it's a scientific
like a certain
experiment.
type of plant that closes up. I have it here actually. It's a Mimosa pudica, also called the sensitive plant. So it's something it says it's similar to a Venus flytrap. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. So no, thanks, Kurt. So yeah, it's a plant that closes basically. So she calls this plant learning. She wants to apply the word learning to it, and there's a lot of resistance for that in the plant scientist community. So that's an interesting finding too. I don't think it's been replicated, but it's very, very intriguing. So what do you guys make of all this? Like, there's basically right now, like we read about some controversy. The controversy today is like basically the situation, like the psychology of the plant biology community is they don't want to fall into something like what happened with Baxter, like because now Baxter, whatever we may think of him, he's looked back on as a kind of a shameful chapter in scientific history because he made all these claims about plants being emotional and conscious, and those claims were completely discredited. But it shifted the public perception pretty radically in a direction that scientists consider to be false. So now scientists are very cautious about making claims about plant intelligence, plant learning, plant memory, even plant communication for a while. And so there's this caution in the plant biology community. But there's some plant biologists who are trying to found a field called plant neurobiology, where even though plants don't have neurons, they want to talk about structure in plants function similarly to neurons. They want to talk. They do want to use these terms: plant intelligence, plant learning. So it's an interesting controversy. Like, what do we make of all this? What do you guys think of the concept of plant intelligence?
I think it's awesome. Go on, Katie.
I was going to say, I don't doubt at all that there's way more left to learn about this than the tiny bit that we know. I hadn't heard of the Baxter Experiments, and I kind of always thought that plants were static and not very reactive. I wasn't aware of any kind of communication between them or anything like this. So the research is shocking, but it holds up, and it really feels like it's probably the tip of the iceberg. I mean, one thing that's interesting to think about is that rice has like 50,000 genes. A lot of plants are more evolved in many ways than humans are, and probably have a lot of adaptive features that we haven't taken note of yet, and we're just starting to, and that's really exciting. I don't think it's crazy to talk about plant neurology or plant neurobiology. Maybe a different name, a less sensational name would be good, or a name that doesn't link it to neurons, since plants don't have neurons. But I don't know. I think it's worth looking into.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny name. So
Yeah. Part of the thing is like there's a few different points. It's worth pointing out too that the concepts like intelligence and memory and learning don't necessarily imply consciousness. Because if you look at like my computer can communicate with the router, but neither is conscious, right? So we're going to talk about plant consciousness next. So stay tuned, everyone. But let's just keep those. Let's try to keep these concepts clear.
So, Ariel, you said how when the Baxter research came out, there was the resistance to it, and now scientists are still resistant to ideas about plant intelligence and things like that.
That's not how I would characterize it. I would say that those results were discredited scientifically. I wouldn't call it resistance.
Right. Okay, yeah. So they're saying that those ideas were discredited, and then so people are still cautious about ideas in that area. So, but I also say I wonder if even though Baxter was discredited, I wonder if it actually opened up the field of discussion. Like it's like when you put out an idea that's really outside the box, it allows you to think about ideas that aren't quite so outside the box, or perhaps ideas like that inspired people like Gaggiano to start researching plant intelligence and looking how they respond and learn.
It's possible. I'm not sure how many modern scientists would be inspired by Baxter. I mean, I know personally, like I heard about the shrimp brine stuff and stuff like that a few years ago, and my response was like, "Wow, that's amazing!" And I just like believed it was true because I heard about it, and like doing more research now and finding out like, wow, it's kind of seems like it's completely not true at all. It personally made me feel a lot more skeptical about this whole area of like plant subjectivity and plant it's made me feel very skeptical. So I relate to that reaction, the reaction of the scientific community, where they seem to be suspicious of this field for that reason. I relate to that feeling a lot. Like if there's, it's like once you've been had, you're more on edge.
It definitely would have gotten the idea out in the public unconscious, if we can say that alone. But I think it's important to note too that we've known, like, people have been studying electromagnetism in plants for a long time before Baxter too, and there's no way he didn't have an impact, but I don't know if I would put that on him.
Yeah, and the field of plant communication was emerging kind of concurrently to when he was doing his lie detector stuff. What do you guys think? What do you guys think of the idea that plants can have intelligence? What do you guys think of the idea of applying the word intelligence to plants?
I don't have any issue with it at all. I think that intelligence is about being able to process information and do useful things with it, and plants can certainly do that in complex ways that we really didn't know.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with applying the word intelligence to plants or applying the word learning. I found it interesting in the article. There's a place where they give this example of, say, a person in a deli and is choosing between a Reuben sandwich and a lox bagel. And obviously we assume there's a kind of intelligent process behind that. And then they ask, well, can the plant do that kind of thing, or is it just responding to the chemicals within itself? And the response, I think it's Mancuso responds, and he says, yeah, that's right. The plant is responding to chemical signals, but so are we within our brain. So he says here, just put ammonium nitrate in the place of a Reuben sandwich and phosphate instead of salmon, and the roots will make a decision. And the writer asks, isn't it the root responding simply to the net flow of certain chemicals? And Mancuso responds, I'm afraid our brain makes decisions in the exact same way. So are we just like plants in a way, just responding to chemical processes in our brain? That's a deeper question, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah,
Well, that's a much deeper question. That's a question about free will. That's a question about consciousness. I tend to take the view that the person quoted in the article took. I do think we're responding to chemicals. So maybe that makes me a little bit more comfortable using the term intelligence for plants.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets into a whole other question, because if it is the case that we have consciousness and plants don't have consciousness, to me that would imply a pretty big categorical difference between what we're doing and what the plant is doing.
I was going to say, but even so, I don't think we don't hesitate to imply the term intelligence to artificial intelligence or learning to machine learning.
That's a funny linguistic thing, because if I say somebody is a fake lawyer, I'm not saying that they're actually a lawyer. If I say artificial intelligence, it's not quite the same, but it's a funny semantic thing.
Sure.
Yeah, I was going to bring that up. In one of the articles, they point out that there's basically two different ways you can use the term intelligence. Like, you can use the term intelligence in the way that Katie used it, which is kind of the limited sense of like something that can process information and solve problems. And by that definition, sure, like a computer is intelligent, a plant is intelligent, bacterium are intelligent. Even by that definition, fire is intelligent, water is intelligent. But if you apply the term,
how is fire intelligent?
Yeah.
Fire uses algorithms. There's algorithms that fires follow to spread through the forest.
Well,
Okay.
there's algorithms, there's predictive algorithms that we can make about how fire will spread through a forest, because that's where it can catch and that's how it can spread. But Well, actually, I'm making a distinction here where I don't know if there is one. So let me think about that a little bit more. I wouldn't say that the fire is taking in information to its fire system and then making a decision about how to spread in order to best figure out how to spread.
And then now you've extended the view of intelligence to include a central controller, which is not clear that plants have.
Well,
Right.
but I'm talking about the plant itself. The decision is made within the plant's system, maybe not necessarily a brain or a central nervous system, but if we're talking about,
Like cells.
yeah.
And I don't see how it's different though, because if you have a root, and the tip of the root is like moving towards where the moisture is, and there's algorithms, it's moving away towards gravity. The root is just responding to the immediate signals in its environment. And if you look at a fire, like a fire in a forest will it'll send out like shoots of flame, and then you could view those as like those are scouts. It's scouting out where the most flammable parts are, and where they are, the fire, it'll respond to the immediate inputs in its environment. It'll respond to the inputs of dry branches and high oxygen and spread there, and then come back to the main fire. I don't see how it's different.
Yeah, that's an interesting
That's an
point.
interesting point.
Yeah, I had a friend in high school. He always used to say to me, "Look, I have this theory. I think fire is a living thing." And I was like, "Get out! Like, what are you trying to say?" But I think he was kind of trolling me. But maybe he had a point. So they do say these days that life is on a spectrum. So it's like when you have these very, very small processes, like is it like the folding of amino acids into proteins or something like that. Even though it's just a little chemical thing that occurs, it's a kind of living process. And I guess in that sense, fire is kind of this. It's a less complex version of that.
I don't know, Kurt. I feel like there's so many definitions of what you're saying. Like we were just
Sorry.
using a definition of intelligence that basically was limited to intelligence is the ability to process information and solve problems. There's nothing in there in my view that implies life. Like you can make an
Right.
argument that implies life. Anyway, to finish the point I was making before, there, often the way we do use intelligence, which I think that's where things get confusing here, because intelligence is a bit of a floating signifier, which means that it can float over different definitions. And sometimes if we're not aware of it doing that process, we can kind of do what I think you just did a little bit, Kurt, sorry, but I think like where we say like, okay, maybe fire is intelligent because it can process information and solve problems. Therefore, like it's alive because intelligence implies life. And that's not the case, because I think we have a second definition of intelligence where we have a different definition of intelligence where intelligence does imply a consciousness and subjectivity and rationality and all these other higher things.
What about slime molds?
What about slime molds?
I don't know very much about slime molds.
Okay. I guess you guys haven't seen this stuff. So sometimes they set this up as a kind of experiment, or slime molds are used as a sort of tool to solve problems. So saying you make a map of the Tokyo subway system, or you just have the major points, the tourist attractions or whatever it is, and you put the slime mold on this map. So at the points that are most important in the city, maybe you put a piece of food. And so the slime mold will start to spread out. And over time, say over several hours, it will start to connect all of the points in a way that's the most optimal, or the very close to optimal way of connecting all these points together. So they're starting to use this to design subway systems, because it's easier to use that than create a computer program to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. I think it falls into the same distinction we were talking about before. There's the second definition of intelligence, which is the ability to process, the first one I guess we brought up, which is the ability to process information and solve problems. The slime mold on some level is doing that. There's these two definitions of intelligence, I think.
Well, there's a difference between a system there's a difference between something that's taking in information and solving a problem versus something that flows in such a way that you can use it as a tool to solve problems for yourself. And something like fire too. I don't know if I would say that fire solves problems. It's an interesting
Well, it solves its own
point.
problems, I suppose. And it's weird because do you need intention to have intelligence? Because if you can't formulate a goal, then how do you know if you've achieved it? So as far as I know, fire can't formulate an intention. A slime mold, I'd say, can formulate an intention because it wants to eat and wants to survive and reproduce.
I mean,
Yeah, and then the question is, can fire do the same thing? I mean, we tend to project intentions onto things when there's iterative systems that are taking in information and adapting, which is basically kind of what life is. But there's not necessarily a clear distinction between life and not life.
I mean, that's an interesting definition of intelligence, Katie, but it sounds like you want to, maybe I'll try mirroring what you said to make sure I understood it correctly. You're basically saying that intelligence, there's a difference between something that is itself intelligent and something that is using inputs, or something that can be used intelligently by a being, or something that solves problems and can be used by something else. Is that what you were saying?
More or less, yeah.
Okay. I mean, that kind of is a definition of intelligence. Okay, well, but I guess that is a circular definition, though, because then you're still not defining intelligence in that definition. So how would you define intelligence in that framework?
I think I should be honest and say that I don't have a deeply philosophically thought out definition of intelligence with all its possible implications.
Okay.
Yeah, it's something about being able to learn and being able to adapt to situations.
Yeah. It's a concept, and I think that the way that I use the concept, it has to do with learning. It has to do with being able to adapt. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the thing being alive, but for some reason, I don't recoil at the idea of plants being intelligent, but the idea of fire being intelligent gives me pause. And I'm trying to nail down what exactly that is.
Yeah. Oh, there was another example. I don't think we mentioned about the echolocation, or not the echolocation, about the plant that was able to find the pole. We didn't mention that example, did we?
No, we didn't.
No, we didn't.
Okay. So in the New York article, The Intelligent Plant, he talks about this case where I think Mancuso was running this experiment. He had time-lapse photography. A young plant, it's like a creeper or a vine or something, a bean plant it was. And there's a metal pole very nearby. And normally what people would assume, what the writer assumes, without ever having investigated it, you would assume that maybe the bean plant just kind of turns around a bit and eventually it will find something to grab onto, and then it will start coiling around that pole. Apparently, at least in a couple of experiments, and it's not entirely clear because there's only a couple that have been done, but what seems to happen is that the bean plant somehow knows where the pole is. So it attempts, it does have an intention, I guess. So maybe that implies it has intelligence, maybe. And it tries to move towards the pole, and then eventually it hooks onto the pole and starts growing around it.
It's worth noting that wasn't an experiment. That was something that the scientist recorded and then brought up as an anecdote.
Right. Okay.
And supposed that the plant might have echolocation, but it's not an experiment because like other the writer Michael Pollan showed it to another scientist, and the other scientist was like, "Well, how do you know he didn't do it 1,000 times?" And then this recorded the one where it got the thing he liked. Like, the guy seems like a really respected scientist, and I'm sure he wouldn't do that. But that's the problem when things aren't experiments. You don't actually know what the conditions are under which that observation was taken.
Yeah. So we don't really know how deep that goes, but it seems cool. Just have to be cautious about making wild claims about it.
It's definitely an interesting thing.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting too. Okay, on to our main question. Everything that we discussed, all these examples, all this conversation, can it help us understand whether plants are conscious? Do you guys think there's evidence that plants might be conscious?
So when it comes to consciousness, I think that John Vervaeke, whose course that we'd recently taken and talked about in a few previous episodes, had a pretty perfect quote on it, which is that trying to explain consciousness is kind of like trying to explain God. Consciousness is if we're trying to talk about are plants conscious, first you need to talk about consciousness itself and what that means. And that's something that I think we all have this internal subjective idea of when it comes to ourselves, but scientists don't have a clear consensus on what it is. We don't know exactly what it is or what it does. There are different ideas about it that I think would be interesting to talk about plants in relation to, but I think that's important to say.
What do you think consciousness is, Katie?
I think that consciousness is an emergent phenomenon of our own brains. I think that it has something to do with the idea of being able to pull memories or pieces of information out and then being able to manipulate them and reintegrate them. And I think that our consciousness is the effect of what's going on in our brains during that process.
So you think there's this idea in philosophy of an epiphenomenon, and it's the idea that something is just a byproduct of something else that's kind of accidental. Like, would you say consciousness is an epiphenomenon of information processing?
I want to clarify that we're just talking about what I think, what I suspect, what I guess, really, because I really don't want to claim to know. But my current idea or model that I hold of it in my head is, yes, I think it's probably most likely an epiphenomenon, or at least started that way.
Oh, so it could start as an epiphenomenon, then evolve into something that actually is useful and actually does something.
It could start as it could have started as an epiphenomenon and then been exapted or adapted in a different way.
Well, what is it? So you think we might be using consciousness for something now?
Absolutely. I think humans are using consciousness for something now.
Okay, so you think we have free will?
I did not say that, and no, I don't.
But if we're using consciousness, do you think consciousness acts on reality? Okay, do you think consciousness acts on reality?
Do I think consciousness acts on reality in and of itself?
At all?
Well, consciousness is a part of reality, so I have to say yes.
Right. So you're saying, like, because it's a part of reality and necessarily needs to interact with things, and so it must have some effect.
Right.
So how do you think consciousness acts on reality? Or what do you think we use it for? Those are the two statements that have been made so far.
Well, I think that consciousness itself plays an important part in the human experience. I mean, it's the whole experience of life, and the fact that we experience things consciously as opposed to just taking in data and having reactions unconsciously probably makes some difference in how we react to things, or how I react to things, though I don't know.
I mean, I can imagine you reacting the exact same way to everything you react to and not being conscious.
Yeah. It's possible. It's possible, but I think that it's likely that the fact that I am conscious has some influence. I don't see why it wouldn't. I mean, certainly, I don't think that I would. I mean, one example would be consciousness altering substances or consciousness altering drugs. I don't think that people would take them if they were unconscious. No, there's probably a million other examples. I think the fact that
They might take it to alter their behavior. They might take it to alter their behavior if they weren't conscious, or they might just take it because of a long string of cause and effects. Like I guess like so you don't think that you don't think people have choice. So you don't think that consciousness can act on reality in a direct way, but you think it acts on reality in an indirect way, like the fact that it exists.
Well, I think that consciousness is a part of reality, and I don't think I don't really believe in free will in the way that most people put it forward, but I do still believe in some form of choice. It's just that to me, choice is about balancing your information with your experiences, with your emotional state, and then coming out with an answer. I'd still define that as a choice. And I think that our conscious experience influences our choices, certainly. Or at least the memory of previous conscious experiences influences our choices.
But when we focus on something, like if we focus on an idea, it can actually change our emotions. So it's kind of weird. So I'd have to ask, does that originate within our consciousness, or is that it's just like the process of our brain causes us to focus on something and then we change our emotions? Or is there actually something originating from within consciousness? I think there is something originating within consciousness, like a divine spark or something. But I can't say for sure.
So all this we've been talking about, like this particular model that you're putting forward, Katie, where consciousness is both an epiphenomenon, but also has some kind of utility where it acts on reality. Do we think that plants might have something similar?
For me, at this point, I couldn't give anything more than a guess, because their systems are so mysterious to me and so not analogous to our own physiologically. If I had to guess, I would say no. But my reasons for that are mostly because I don't think it would have necessarily been adaptive for plants to evolve consciousness.
Why not? I mean, they need to avoid.
Hang on. You initially said that consciousness had not evolved in an adaptive way. You said it evolved as an epiphenomenon, and that later it was exapted adaptively.
Well, I think that. Well, what does it mean for something to evolve adaptively versus not evolve adaptively? Everything evolves based on mutations, which may or may not.
And the difference between an adaptive evolutionary change and a non-adaptive one is an adaptive one provides some benefit. A non-adaptive one could just be a side effect of a different change that produces a benefit, or it could be a neutral change. Like humans have a lot of back problems because we stand upright, but we didn't evolve. There's no benefit to having a lot of back problems. There's benefits to standing upright. Back problems are a side effect of a different adaptation, which is itself not adaptive. Or like humans being born premature compared to other animals and being like very like helpless when they're born. That's not an adaptation. That's a side effect of a different adaptation of us having bigger heads. So those would be like, you could call them epiphenomenal or side effects. Something like blue eyes also, that's a different thing. That's just a random mutation that's neutral, not really, probably not super beneficial or super negative.
Blue eyes does have, it does have benefit for reproduction. Like because blue eyes stand out so much.
Maybe it does, but anyway, I think you guys get the point. Sorry, Katie, continue with your point.
Okay, so to clarify what I think, because it probably sounds like I'm contradicting myself. If I had to guess, which, like I'm saying, nobody knows this, like especially not me, but I would guess that initially consciousness was an effect of there being a lot of processing power in the brain that was evolved. I think that it was initially an epiphenomenon, and maybe it was later actually selected for. I think that it was useful, but I don't think that it was. I think that probably it was a side effect of other things, at least initially, and maybe still.
Okay, so that makes sense. So you're making the claim that, so you're basically saying you don't really see anything in plants that would necessarily imply that they have that concentrated processing power that would produce consciousness as an epiphenomenon, as you suspect happened with humans.
Right.
With mammals, animals.
Right. As I suspect happened with animals, I don't, because plants' processing power seems to be distributed. But I mean, that doesn't mean it's impossible. I really don't know how consciousness came about. That's my guess, that it was an epiphenomenon. But another reason is because even though I don't think that consciousness like purposely evolved in us, maybe it did. But when I think about the idea of could consciousness have purposefully evolved in plants, I see less utility for plants because they live on such a long time scale, and the things that threaten them, at least usually, they don't react to them quickly enough in the moment. There are some plants that do, though, so maybe they would be a different case.
Do you think plants that are more responsive might be more conscious?
Maybe.
I want to turn to some different models of consciousness. Kurt, I suspect you might have a different model of consciousness from Katie. I'd be curious how you define consciousness, or what you think it is.
Yeah, well, I thought about it a lot, and one firm thing which I figured out was it's not easy to say what it is. So I'd say the definition of consciousness is the ability to have subjective, qualitative experiences, like experiences of color and sound and this sort of thing. I don't know where it comes from. I do suspect that it's not something limited to brains. So there is this kind of cultural bias that we have where we assume that our consciousness is in our brain, but not every culture sees it that way. So some cultures see as consciousness is in the heart, or the seat of consciousness, I should say, or consciousness is in the belly. And I think if you explore your own experience, you can find that you can actually be conscious of your entire body. And then there's those experiments that Viveki talks about, or just a little test that you can do yourself where you pick up a probe and you, let's say, a pen, and you tap a cup with it. And it seems like you're conscious. You can be conscious of your fingers, of the probe, and of the cup at different points. So it's a very strange experience. It's like it's not entirely clear where if the consciousness has a point or a place where it actually is.
I mean, I would bring up as a counterexample to that. I can, if I were to, God forbid, like break my neck right at my brainstem, then I would no longer be able to consciously feel the rest of my body. I would no longer be able to inhabit it consciously. But there is no way I can be separated from my brain, at least not that we know. Maybe out-of-body experiences are an example of this. We don't know, but there is no way I can be separated from my brain as far as we are able to establish now with our current level of knowledge, or at least this is the mainstream view. There's no way I can be separated from my brain and remain conscious.
There are neurons throughout the body also that they communicate with the brain.
Yeah, like there's a strip of neurons at the top of the brain, the sensory system, and like when you feel something in your finger, it's a connection between the nerves in your finger and the spot up here. But I would argue that even though there's neurons in both places, it's the consciousness is in here. Because we can get rid of the arm, we can completely get rid of the arm, and I can remain conscious. but it can't get rid of the head and remain conscious.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah, there's some kind of special role for the brain. It's kind of weird. So Katie was saying how there's neurons in other parts of the body, so in the heart and in the stomach and probably every other organ, I think. So if somebody asked you and you're a paraplegic and they say to you, well, are you conscious of other parts of your body? And you say no, your brain is disconnected from the rest of your body, but are they conscious? Do the other parts of your body remain conscious even though you're not in contact with them?
I mean, I would argue that the other parts of my body, I don't know if I would argue this, but I think a physicalist argument would go like neurons are necessary but not sufficient for consciousness. Because like, for example, like you have like the cerebellum, which is in one of our articles points out, you have their cerebellum, which is very rich with neurons. It has, I think, the most neurons of any part of your body. But a cerebellum on its own there's no seat of consciousness there. All it does is it helps you balance and stuff, and it helps you type and do fine motor movements. But you can completely remove the cerebellum and a person remains like virtually unchanged. They just like have balance issues after that.
I believe that the consciousness arises from the connections, not from the individual parts. It arises from the connections and the way that they interact with each other.
Right. So that's similar to this integrated information theory, which we'll talk about soon, I guess.
So basically, the idea behind integrated information theory, it's this theory that this guy Giulio Tonini came up with, and he basically says that consciousness is, I don't know if he says it's a result or if it is identical with the tightly integrated, dense information processing. So he would basically say like, if you have something that is like densely information processing, then you have consciousness. And that's just what our brain is. It's just dense information processing. So we have consciousness because we've reached a certain threshold where it's enough information processing to produce a complex conscious experience.
Right. So Chalmers, in the TED Talk, when David Chalmers explains these ideas, he talks about how, say, even a photon has consciousness because it's a part of the system and it's integrated in other things, but it's only in the human brain where these things are such an integrated system that we have such a high amount of consciousness.
Well, so David Chalmers is a philosophy with a completely different idea of consciousness than Tononi's integrated information theory. He presents two ideas, basically one that consciousness is fundamental so it's not an emergent phenomenon. It's not something that comes from all the connections, but that it's linked to information processing, like more information processing equals more consciousness. So he would say that like a photon has a tiny bit of consciousness and that it being integrated into a larger system would have a more complex consciousness. But Tononi integrated information theory wouldn't say that an individual photon would have consciousness.
Ah, right. Yes. Important distinction. Thanks.
It's worth noting also that Chalmers in that TED Talk wasn't necessarily saying he endorses the ideas he presented. He was just presenting them as ideas. In the end, he says he does view consciousness as a fundamental thing, like space and time. So something that's not going to be explained, but that exists at a base level. And that he's open to this idea of like panpsychism, which is this idea that consciousness is in everything. It's in a photon, it's in a plant, a bacterium, a rock, everything.
Certainly under a panpsychic model, it would make sense that plants would be relatively conscious, much more conscious than many other things. And certain types of plants may be similar in levels of consciousness to insects or crustaceans or something of that nature. But if it's just about information processing and it's a fundamental thing, because I think that's what's demonstrated through all the plant intelligence studies is plants definitely process information. Yeah. So, I mean, if consciousness is purely just linked to information processing, which I don't think it is, but if that's the model, if we're going off of one of these models of consciousness where consciousness is just linked to information processing, then I think it would make sense to believe that plants are conscious on some level.
Unless you say it's density of information processing, because then, as you pointed out before, plants process information in a distributed way. So they don't have like a single point where there's dense information processing happening the way animals do necessarily. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It almost seems like this integrated information theory almost implies like panpsychism. Because there's kind of information processing happening like everywhere all the time.
Yeah.
I think this kind of gets back to what we were talking about with fire. And if it's intelligent, I don't feel comfortable saying that fire processes information within itself.
Why not? I mean, things go into it and other things go out of it. So they come in with one form, one formation, and they come out with another formation.
Well, I don't see fires sensing their surroundings and then making decisions or acting differently and adaptively based on it. It's just fire goes where it can.
Right.
I mean, I think though you can say the exact same thing about a digital computer. Like a digital computer is just electricity going where it can within a particular system that we've specifically designed, where we've specifically designed and constrained the matter to get the electricity to flow in a particular way that's useful to us.
I suppose that's true, and it's all in a continuum.
Like a computer, like a fire can be a computer just as much as a computer. Like if you were looking for a computer to calculate like what is the most efficient way to burn this forest, a fire would be a great computer for that.
Yeah, a destructive calculator.
You can only do it once. You can only use it once, but it's still a computer.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess this gets to the idea of the ways that different objects or different phenomena, like computers versus fire, I don't know what noun to use where they both fit in that category. Different things interact with their environment. It is, maybe information processing isn't so fundamental, but it is on a continuum. Like if a rock is rolling down a hill and it gets knocked off course based on, some other rock that was in its way, would you say that the rock is processing information because it changes direction as it bumps into the other rock?
I think in a very general sense, yes.
I would say it processes information, and I wouldn't call it intelligent. I think you could, but you can use the rock rolling down a hill and hitting another rock. Like you can build a computer in that way. You can actually probably build a Turing complete computer if you had a big enough hill and enough rocks rolling down hills. Mm-hmm. So that's why. I mean, I like kind of doing this episode kind of has made me have more respect for the term artificial intelligence, it does seem to me that intelligence needs to be connected to a being with intentionality, like what we were talking about before. Like I am more skeptical of this idea now that inanimate objects can be intelligent. It seems like once you grant that to a computer, or you have to grant that to everything.
Well, okay, here's maybe this. When we're talking about artificial intelligence with computers, generally speaking, we are kind of talking about beings with intentionality. AI are computer programs that are programmed with an intention that then iterate on that intention and kind of evolve like a life form. That's kind of the distinction that we make between AI and other kinds of computers.
No, that's just how we interpret it though. Like with computers and with the AI, we're just interpreting it that way. Like if you have an AI and it's like it's learning to speak English better and better or whatever, it's completely meaningless if you don't have humans interpreting the English. It's just humans have designed the way that matter is moving in that particular object so that it's coming up with symbols and patterns that are meaningful to us and that matter to us when they improve. And you can if you want to look at like an iterative process, you can find iterative processes in any kind of inanimate matter. You can find iterative processes in how a river carves out a path to the ocean. It's it's an iterative process designed by nature instead of by humans. But in both cases, I think if you apply intelligent to one, you have to apply intelligent to both.
I think that is kind of what distinguishes life and maybe intelligence from other things. Not just their iterative processes, but that they're like self-replicating and editing iterative processes towards a goal. I mean, in life's case, the goal wasn't set by a human. The goal is just kind of implicit because the things that survive better, or the things that reproduce better.
There is something different, it seems to me, between a tree and a river.
Yes.
It does seem like a tree, but yeah, like you said, it's alive.
It reproduces.
That's not the only difference, though, because a river can reproduce as well. It can make baby rivers.
Well, but a tree, as part of its life cycle, reproduces. It's one of the things that distinguishes it as a tree.
There's about 6 conditions that that scientists, biologists typically use to distinguish life from not. So for something to be alive, it has to be responsive to the environment, it has to grow and change, it has to be able to reproduce, it has to have a metabolism and breathe, it has to maintain homeostasis, it has to be made up of smaller parts, and it has to pass on traits to its offspring. So you can find non-living things that check off any individual one of those traits, but you can't find non-living things that check off all of them.
Sure. But do you think that life is, or that life versus not life is a hard line, and there was some kind of divine spark in life that is not in other things, or do you think that it was a continuum?
I think you can say that there is a discrete line between life and non-life without positing a divine spark, because that is what mainstream biology does, and the divine spark is not part of the doctrine.
Well, but what I'm asking is, like, even if we don't talk about a divine spark, do you think that there's a continuum between living things and non-living things, between processes that we consider life and processes that are not life?
At some level, yes, and at some level, no. It depends where you're looking. You know, if we're talking out, you know, even from a physicalist perspective, like if you're looking at the level of I mean, who even knows? Like if you're looking at the level of quarks, probably there isn't. You would, with at least the current level of knowledge, if you take a set of quarks or atoms, but even atoms, you'd probably be able to tell if it was a living thing or a non-living thing, or at least you'd be able to make a good guess. But let's say quarks, you're just looking at the quarks, you probably wouldn't be able to tell which quarks were living quarks, which quarks were inorganic quarks. But you know, if you look at a different level, like at a molecular level, life looks very different from non-life. At a cellular level, non-life doesn't even have cells. Like, and it's interesting. It's worth noting that, like, in the past, in the 1700s, scientists believed in spontaneous generation, which was this idea that
if you put a bag of wheat in the laundry, a week later it will have mice in it because the mice just popped out of existence.
it's the idea that living things can emerge from non-living things,
Right?
and that happens all the time. And it was proven incorrect. Now they know that only life only comes from life, and the exception is the first cell. They believe the first cell somehow, in mechanisms that are unknown, emerged from inorganic matter, but that every single cell since then has emerged from another living cell. That is the scientific consensus. And so to me, that the fact that it seems that by and large, with the one exception, life only emerges from other life implies a categorical difference, because we don't see like shifting and moving between these categories. There does seem to be a line.
I think something like fire is an interesting case. It's obviously it's not anything that we would define as life, but the way that it moves, the way that it spreads, the way that it grows and
Yeah, well,
dies.
it meets quite a few of these criteria. Responsiveness to the environment, yeah. Growth and change, yeah. Ability to reproduce, yeah. Have a metabolism and breathe. Well, it doesn't have a metabolism. It does breathe. Maintain homeostasis. No, it does. I don't think it does that.
No.
Being made of cells, no. Passing traits on to offspring. Arguably.
Well, not really.
No,
The thing is,
not really.
fire spontaneously generates all the time.
Yeah.
And it's not like all fires came from every other fire and then they're adapting and changing and growing. Fires
Yeah.
start and die all the time. It's a bit different. But when you think about something like AI, can you list those criteria again with AI?
Responsiveness to environment,
Yes.
growth and change,
Yes.
ability to reproduce,
Yes.
have metabolism and breathe.
No, but that kind of seems biased.
Okay, well, but I mean, if you're doing that, if you're doing that for each one, then it like stops being.
Well, I'm just saying that there's something a little
Anthropocentric.
bit different between having metabolism and breathing. Seem like we're defining life in such a way that it has to be the kinds of things that we see on Earth.
Yes.
Yeah, but I mean, this list is flawed, but it's like designed to exclude things like fire and water and
Yeah.
oceans, like and concepts and and books and words and fiction. So once you start throwing away the ones that confine you to biology, then you start having to define everything as alive, and maybe everything is alive in a way.
Well, we could throw away breathing or divide. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that the way that artificial intelligence moves and operates is in many ways very, very similar to life. And when you categorize things, you overestimate the similarities between the things that fall on one side of the line, and you overestimate the differences between the things that kind of fall closely on each side of the line. I'm saying that AI is pretty similar to life in a lot of important ways.
I mean, so are memes. Like if we're throwing away the ones of these that imply biology, then you have to categorize memes and words as being alive.
No, because they don't reproduce themselves. It's humans continuously produce memes. A meme doesn't
it?
Not unless you're saying that a meme produces more memes and humans are the mechanism for memes to produce more memes.
But now who's introducing arbitrary lines and constraints though? Like this definition doesn't say that it has to reproduce by itself. A lot of organisms
it's like a parasite.
If it had to reproduce by itself, then flowers wouldn't be alive.
You can't exclude it from the system. You can't treat it in a vacuum.
It would probably be interesting to study memes within frame of memes as life forms. You would probably get some new insight that you didn't if you looked at it through different perspectives. It would probably be a useful model.
Memes originally emerged as a metaphor through genes. Memes and genes. So it's kind of where the idea of memes came from.
Yeah, I guess I should clarify. I was thinking of like image, like JPEG memes when you said memes.
Yeah, but they work. I mean, they fit into the model as well. So
yeah.
Their type of meme. Yeah, no, I do tend to think there's a line between living and non-living things, and there's a line between conscious and non-conscious things. But there's also a continuity between all things at different levels, at a different level.
I think that the categories are useful, living and non-living, conscious and non-conscious, but that sometimes the lines that we draw can cause us to miss things. So it's also useful to take away the categories and look at the spectrum.
I think there's a difference between a line that, I mean, I agree that there is a spectrum, but I wouldn't say the categories are completely defined by the lines that we draw. I think these categories are real on an objective level, and the lines that we draw are trying to imperfectly capture where those real lines fall, because we can't always know exactly where they are. In the case of life, we have a pretty good idea. In the case of consciousness, we have a pretty bad idea. And in both cases, we're trying to come up with like a way of articulating where that line is. But just because we can't articulate where the line is perfectly doesn't mean the line is a construction of humans.
Doesn't it? No. I don't mean like the different categories are a construction of humans, but the line itself.
With consciousness, it's that there is a line, unless everything is conscious.
That's not true.
Because it means something to be conscious or to not be conscious. So you don't you don't think it means there's a real difference between conscious and not conscious?
You can have things that are conscious and non-conscious. Like there's a difference between black and white, but there's no line of grayness.
There might be a spectrum between, it might be possible to be partially conscious. That is true. But I do still think that consciousness has like a real ontological reality.
I do too. I think that there's real differences. Just to clarify, that's not where I'm disagreeing with you. I'm disagreeing with you about there being a line.
Okay, so basically I was just saying, I don't know whether plants are conscious. I do believe there are conscious beings and non-conscious beings. And conscious beings are a subset of life. And I don't know whether plants are conscious. I suspect they might be, but I think it's impossible to know when they're so different from us. I know that I am conscious. I strongly believe other humans are conscious. I strongly believe other mammals are conscious. I think birds and reptiles are probably conscious, almost certainly. High probability of that too. I'm actually kind of skeptical as to whether insects, crustaceans, and other invertebrates are conscious, although I also suspect they might be. I believe bacterium probably aren't conscious, but it's really hard to know when it comes to plants. I think it's definitely a very fascinating mystery. Do people have other thoughts on plant consciousness?
Yeah, I would say one thing you said, like with bacteria, if an individual cell can't be conscious, then how can we, as a combination of cells, be conscious? I don't really know. I guess, yeah, it's a question of that information integration theory, or
something can be more than the sum of its parts, right? Like,
right, true.
I think I have lots of cells in my body that aren't conscious, and if I remove them from the seat of consciousness, then it's not, there's not like, I don't really think there's anything there. I think there's like, I can culture some tissue and have it still remain alive and put it in a terry dish and look at it through a microscope, and it would still be a living thing, but I don't believe it would be conscious. Like, I think it's the something can be more than the sum of its parts. I think that's a big lesson of our universe and of life.
Mm-hmm.
True. Yeah.
Like individual ants are pretty stupid, but you put thousands of them together and they can construct extremely complex things and coordinate and.
I'm a total bigot against ants. I don't think they're conscious.
But they are intelligent. I think that's Katie's point.
Well, I would say an anthill is intelligent.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and an individual ant is somewhat intelligent too. It's probably
So I have heard people say that an individual ant has a negative IQ, but an entire ant nest can have like an IQ of 20 or 30 or something.
It's kind of impressive what an anthill can do. Like an individual ant, it can't even survive on its own. It not even smart enough to survive. But an anthill can do like crazy, like the whole thing can be like mathematically constructed, so they've optimized the distance between like the graveyard, the garbage pit, and the food hole, so that to minimize infection and maximize efficiency. Which you need to be quite smart to do that. You need to be like probably smarter than a dog, but
yeah.
You could say the same thing about our neurons, our cells.
Yeah, so I think we're just about ready to wrap up. Do we want to talk about ethical implications? Have some brief final thoughts about ethical implications before we close. Do we think plants? After all this we've discussed, what do you guys think? How might this influence our ethics?
I gotta eat. I know that much.
Yeah.
I'm not going to. There's a story from India where a Zoroastrian is sitting meditating under a tree, and he says, "Oh no, what am I going to do? If I get up, I have to stand on this grass. I'm going to crush some of these ants and its other microorganisms that I'm going to affect." And he's like, "I don't know." A tiger comes up behind him, and he says, I think I have a solution for both of our problems. And he eats the Zoroastrian. So, so the moral of the story is you can't really live without disturbing something.
Yeah, it's true. You can't live without disturbing something. I spent a little over 3 years as a vegan. I'm still mostly plant-based, and I have a lot of influence from that time and that philosophy. But within that community, the idea of plant consciousness is actually a pretty big discussion, and a lot of times it makes people really angry if you bring it up, because for many vegans, the idea is that you shouldn't cause unnecessary suffering to conscious or sentient life. So if plants were conscious, that's something that a lot of people will use as like an argument against veganism. Well, like, look at you guys, you care about animals, but you're just like brutally murdering all your salads. The best response to that probably is one that you have to kill a lot of plants to feed animals, to kill animals to eat, and you end up killing like way more plants in order to do that, because you lose so much energy, like an order of magnitude of energy, every time you let an animal process something to feed another animal and go up the food chain. But I don't know. Some vegans take this seriously and decide to become fruitarians and only eat the fruit of plants, basically, because fruit is something that plants have adapted for animals to eat, and they feel that by doing that, they're not harming the plant, they're not killing the plant, they're just taking the fruit that the plant wants you to eat. That's probably extremely unhealthy, and I don't recommend it, and that's not where I would go if I believed that plants were conscious, but some people do it.
There was a quote in one of the articles we read, which was people all this back and forth about plant consciousness and this and that, and one of these scientists just said, like, plants eat light, isn't that enough? And I thought that was really good, because it's just kind of like, with all this stuff about consciousness, I think sometimes we put consciousness up on a pedestal. And I mean, I love consciousness, I think it's great and it's super important, and I'm really happy I am conscious, but I don't think it's the be all end all. And I think a lot of these, like, whether or not plants are conscious, they still are alive. They still are living beings of like dignity and majesty, and we owe so much to them, like especially trees, which are, our ancestral home. And so for me, it's like, I think it's important to like kind of move away a little bit from this idea that, like, even though consciousness is a thing of great value, it's not the only thing of value. And like, whether or not plants are conscious, they still deserve, our respect and our appreciation. I think that for me, that's, go ahead, Katie.
I want to take a little bit of issue with that, because if something is unconscious, yes, we can choose to respect it. But I think that consciousness is the be all end all, because that's the only, if you have an individual experience, that's the only way that something can matter to you. So like, maybe I can choose to give respect to a plant or not, but if the plant is unconscious and doesn't have an experience, then it makes no difference to the plant or not. There's no being there to be harmed if I harm it, versus if it's conscious, there absolutely is. And from the perspective of a conscious being, their consciousness and their perception is the entire universe to them, as it is to us. It's everything. And if there is no consciousness, then there's nothing from their perspective. There is no perspective. I think it's really important.
there's still, there's the consequentialist argument that you could make. Like, if you hurt the plant, you're hurting the squirrel that lives in the plant, and the squirrel's the one that really matters. But I don't really think necessarily that's where I would go with that. I would say you're not hurting. I would say plants are beings, whether they're conscious or not. And they are still a part of being, and they are a living part of being. And that is significant. And I think the difference between us, Katie, is I wouldn't locate morality on the subjective level. I think morality transcends the subjective.
Why is life significant?
It's not clear.
Morally significant.
It's
like
not.
Bacteria.
It's not clear why life. It's not clear why life. It's not clear why life is significant. It's not clear why humans are significant. It's not clear why consciousness is significant. It's not clear why any of this is significant. But we have a strong intuitive sense that it is. There's a strong historical case that it has been made significant in virtually every culture. And I would say the story we're a part of seems to strongly suggest that life is very significant. And the feelings that we feel that life invokes in us and that plants evoke in us suggest significance.
I think it's really clear why consciousness is significant from the perspective of someone who's conscious.
I mean, I think consciousness is more significant than life, to be clear. Like, if it was like, you stab this puppy, or, you cut down this sapling, like, I would cut down the sapling. Like, I think consciousness has a special significance. I don't want to diminish that, but I think life has a significance on its own. I think in our focus on consciousness, it's easy to diminish that, or to not even to diminish it, but to completely discount it.
I can respond to that, but it's such a deep question and such a fundamental different worldview. I guess I recognize that you think that life is inherently significant, and I can see that. For me, as soon as you say something is significant, it begs the question, to whom? And then it comes back to consciousness. But that's my lens.
But I mean, I think a tree is still a whom, even though it's not conscious. It's still a living thing, and it still does have, I think trees and plants can still have intentionality without consciousness. Like, there still is something there, like something self-directed and self-contained that doesn't exist, I think, even in digital computers. And I think it can exist in the absence of a subjective experience, which I am agnostic about whether or not plants have. Which is a separate argument from the one I'm making before, just to clarify.
I would give more credit to computers, I think, than you would. Maybe not computers that are in existence now, maybe certain forms of AI that are in existence now. I think that the intentionality that plants have arose from the preconditions of the world and the natural process that, things that reproduce better. So you have an intentionality that's kind of built into the evolution process that way. But I think that AI has just as much intentionality. It's just that it arises from preconstructed preconditions. There's like an extra layer of intentionality there that's different from the way that plants arose. I mean, maybe there was a great intentionality behind it all that designed it all. I don't think so, but there could be another layer for plants too. But I don't think that plants can have intentionality, or that a non-conscious being can have intentionality in a way that AI or a computer-based intentional, iterative, adaptive, reproductive system couldn't.
I think there is a difference. I guess I'm not entirely sure this is the right answer, and you might have to think about this more, but I mean, I agree with you that plants and everything else that exists came from the world. Like, there's nowhere else it can come from other than the world that exists. But I guess I just have a little more faith in the world than I do about the conscious constructs of human technological thought.
I think I'd agree with you there.
Okay. I think that's a good place to end it. Kurt, do you have any final words you want to make?
No, I think I've said my piece. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for watching, for coming on this journey of plant consciousness with us. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, please like, subscribe, check out our Patreon, do all that, and we will see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on the Multiversity. We hope you found this episode both mind-bending and enjoyable.
We can be found all over the social media space and at multiversitypodcast.com.
If you like this content, give us a like, comment, follow, share, or support us on Patreon.
Catch you on the flip side.